So I really try to surround myself. I try to create beautiful spaces, but also create beauty in relationships, beauty in my home, and beauty with music, laughter, that kind of thing. Because God, that's where God resides. God created so much beauty around us, and He wants us to live in it because He's there.
Welcome to the 14th episode of the Ambassadors Podcast, where we hear Christians' testimonies of how God has worked in their lives. I'm your host, Haley. I'm here with Lois. I met Lois at my current church. I appreciate Lois's heart for discipleship and for having meaningful conversations. I love seeing Lois be her granddaughter's biggest fan at a track meet and also enthusiastically cheering for strangers, which was awesome. Welcome, Lois.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So some getting to know you questions here. What would you say is your favorite season and why?
Oh, well, I'm a gardener, so spring is my favorite season because I love to see new things push up out of the ground after a hard winter. Just reminds me of renewal.
I love it. It's a deep answer too. That's cool. And how would you say you spend your free time?
That's a good question too, because I'm going to be 70 soon in a few months. And as I've gotten older, I realize that there's not enough time to spend on things that I'm not interested in. So I really honed my activities down to several things. The things that I find the most beauty in, and that is music and gardening, people, and detailing my house. So creative people need to create. So I like to spend more time in doing things that are creative rather than like busy work.
Yeah. And that's awesome.
I don't do Tupperware parties.
What's a Tupperware party? I don't think I've heard
Tupperware party?
Yeah.
People get together and look at new Tupperware products and then order them.
Oh, gotcha.
Gotcha. Plastic Tupperware.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And what would you say is your favorite movie and why?
Oh, I'm not a big movie person, but one that made a big impression on me was The Last Emperor many years ago. It was beautifully done. Tragic. It was just powerful in its screenplay and historically accurate. So
that's cool. What is that about?
It was about the last emperor in China.
Okay.
Yeah, when the communists took over.
Gotcha. Okay. That's awesome. And what would you say is your favorite story in the Bible?
Oh, that's a good one too. Now that evolves because depending on your life experiences, one story may hit you in one decade, and then a couple of decades later, another story affects you in a different way. So my current favorite story is about Elijah. When Elijah was so discouraged, the prophet Elijah was so discouraged, and he ran away from his troubles, and God said, take some rest. And he brought him food and drink, and he slept. It reminds me of a compassionate God who really understands us when we're discouraged and feel like we're at the end of our rope. He encouraged Elijah to rest. I like Elijah because he was really human. And he worked so hard to please the Lord and to obey the Lord in his prophecy and turning Israel around. And then people were, hunting for his life. And he got discouraged. And I'm very human and I get discouraged too. So it was a good reminder.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story of God's provision and rest and all those things. Yeah, that's awesome. Who was in your immediate family growing up, and then who do you live with now?
Okay, so I grew up in Long Island and then transplanted here, which was a whole story in and of itself because it was like moving to another planet. I was definitely a quintessential New Yorker, up with the fashion and, big hair. I grew up in basically a middle-class street, blue-collar workers. My mother was a nurse and my father was a printer for a ministry. And I have two siblings. I was a middle child, and it took me a while to find myself being the middle child.
And who do you live with now?
Sorry.
No, you're good.
I live with my husband. I have one daughter,
awesome.
And she's about 40. So I live with my husband, Neil.
Awesome. Did you grow up in a Christian home?
I did. It's interesting. When you are coming into adulthood, you have one view of your childhood. As I grew older, I realized that my parents did a pretty good job in raising us in a balanced way. So they were believers, but they didn't really talk about their faith personally, but they grew us up in the admonition of the Lord. We always were in church. We were the last ones out the door. My father was an elder on the missions board. My mother was actually on the search committee for a new pastor. So she was in music ministry, played the organ, and taught children's choir. So they were very involved. They were relatively balanced in their faith, I think. They weren't overbearing in their strictness with us, but, for sure we had a lot of boundaries with them. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was a typical young person. I chafed at anything, that they restricted me on, of course. Movies and, boyfriends. Yeah. I never should have dated in the first place, right?
Yeah. What was what was the denomination you were part of? And also, because it was New York, I'm curious, was it a really large church?
Yeah, that's interesting. A lot of Baptists. My parents were raised in Baptist churches. They both came from Brooklyn. Their parents were born in Brooklyn from immigrants. There was a lot of Baptist churches on Long Island, but we happened to grow up in a Presbyterian church, and it was a very large church at the time. There were about 1,000 members. Okay, yeah. It was a great church. It was really active in missions and ministries, and I thought it was a fabulous place to grow up. We had a lot of opportunity. Yeah, so they were Presbyterian. They were Baptists attending a Presbyterian church, so we did not adhere to infant baptism, but I know for some there are scriptural reasons for that, which always remain a mystery to me.
And how did your church involvement, you would say, influence your relationship with God early on?
I was a little disconnected from that. Our youth group was not well managed. They went through a lot of youth directors, 6 months here, a year there. But I would say, I thought about this question after I read it, and I would say that since I did not volunteer for ministry a whole lot, because I left Long Island when I was about 25, I was more involved in music. I think my greatest effect growing up was from watching other believers around me, older saints in the church. We had a fabulous choral director and organist, and he was a very gracious, soft-spoken man who really lived his faith by his actions rather than his words. So we had really good role models. We had really good Bible teachers, and I sat in on a lot of adult Bible studies. But I wouldn't say that my youth leaders were instrumental that much because they were so sparse. Mm-hmm. I would say it was more than just watching people live out their Christian lives that were around us. Yeah. My parents' friends were really great people. They didn't say much, but you could always count on them.
Yeah, and how would you encourage people then to be a good example to others younger than them in the church?
I would say make opportunity with young people around you. I think young people feel invisible in the hallway. I think that, as I said a moment ago, I think connecting with young people when they're young, it creates continuity in their faith because all they see and hear about are their own friends' faith. I would also add talking about your faith to young people and taking every opportunity to pour into them. Take them out to lunch. I read in Navigators magazine probably 10 years ago an article that talked about the ministry of showing up, which I talked to you about at the games. You don't have to do a lot to show a young person that they have value. Just showing up at their games, their shows and their plays and their birthday parties and, chatting with them if they've been involved in something up front on the stage. I think that creates connectivity. What you have to say then has worth.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've created trust with them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good answer. Yeah. And what would you say were internal and or external struggles you had growing up?
Oh, that's a big one because that's a very strong thread throughout the next 3 or 4 decades of my life. So I'm not a follower. And I think it's important for every young person to figure out how God made them and who they are. I knew that I did not want to sit back and just follow. I always wanted to swim upstream in everything, whether it was the clothes that I wore, the activities that I was in. And that also brought me into a place of trouble in my 20s. So well, I would say that I squandered the best years of my life on myself, which were my 20s, from 20 to 30. As I got into my late teens, I began to squirm and push back against being super saturated with Christianity and Christian talk. And I just think as a young person or anyone, there's just so much you can absorb in your Christian life around you. And I would have, even in our church today, I really would have benefited from, instead of just speaking into us ad nauseum, to work out our faith on the street. There wasn't enough of that. So by the time I got to college, I was sick to death of church and Bible teaching. And so the problem was I went to a Christian college and there was a very strong atmosphere of legalism. So there wasn't any room for questioning or saying, I don't agree with that, or, doesn't that smack of legalism? Questions were looked at as rebellious, which is one of the reasons why I'm in young adult, encouraging young adults today, is because there wasn't enough freedom to ask questions or just to say, I'm not sure I buy into that. The result of that was that because I came from pillars of the church, was that I spent probably 10 years, one person on the outside and another person on the inside. I think it's Aristotle that said the definition of integrity is that, I'm not sure if I have the right philosopher. He said, may the inner man and the outer man be one. And it's actually biblical because God hates deceit. So I spent a lot of my 20s thinking one way, but living it out, on the outside. I tried to follow the gospel externally, but it didn't really have any value to me internally. I also had a lot of struggles making God real in my life. And I probably spent that same amount of time trying to get myself together spiritually. I'd like to tag on that because I want to take this opportunity to speak to that one person who's grown up in a Christian home and realize that they're not a follower as well. And James Dobson, probably in my early 30s, in his program, there was a testimony of a man who was like an old codger. And he came from a life that was really carnal, maybe alcoholism, living on the streets. I don't really remember his story, but I do remember the most important thing that I heard. He said, I was a rebel. And when I came to the Lord, I realized that I was a rebel for the wrong side. And it gave me permission to accept myself. I didn't need to be a follower all the time. I just needed to be on the right team, or the team that had value for me, which was as a believer, because I knew God was real and it was the truth, but I didn't know how to make my personality and Christianity mix. But when I realized I could be a rebel for the truth, it all made sense to me. So in my 20s, early 20s, I couldn't pray because everyone around me prayed all these, fluffy, highfalutin prayers and always sounded so spiritual. So I decided that if I was going to follow God, that I needed to be 100% genuine. So instead of praying a fancy prayer for food, I'd say, thanks, God, because that was the most genuine thing I could say. And I didn't want to add anything else because I didn't think I meant it. So that was a very small beginning to me. And there are many times that in my seeking who God was in a real way, I sat with my Bible on my lap, but I couldn't read it. But I opened the Bible and I thought about God. It was very laborious because I had probably 7 or 8 years of this big wall that I put up against Christianity. I knew God was real and I knew it was the truth and I wanted to follow him, but I didn't want to do it the way everyone else did.
So how would you think that encourage somebody who yeah, might be in a situation where there is a lot of legalism. Like, how should they
Mm,
navigate that in a way that's God honoring and not just like, I guess, being really, really annoyed with everybody around them, in a
mm.
loving way.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Well, first of all, just start. Just start in your own way in seeking God. I accompanied a woman to an attorney when she was going through a difficult divorce, and he was a believer. And he said, don't let the past with your husband throw you off your spot with God. The phrase that is really important to me is that Christ came to set me free. He came to set me free from myself. When I read scripture, one of the myths about Christianity is that I heard this a lot in this area. It's very cultural. It's not that way like in an urban center where I grew up. Ours is not to question why. That's a biblical myth. There are times that I believe that we need to accept what God has given us with grace and peace and trust. But everything I see in the Bible is very assertive and aggressive. He says, ask, seek, and knock. It's active. We need to be actively seeking God. To question all of if we're involved in legalism, in a large way, to always ask yourself, pitting it against scripture, of course, always. But I always ask myself, is this normal? Is this a normal decision? When I'm trying to, have a conversation with someone or ask myself, is this the best decision for me as a believer? I don't use the word normal, but I always ask myself, what is the healthiest, most biblical direction to go in? Even if it's uncomfortable, if it's the right thing to do, then we need to move forward on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and not just appease people around us because we're afraid of ruffling feathers. If I really feel that I'm ruffling feathers and I can't really speak truth, then there are many times I have to just step out of the situation, because if I'm not going to be effective in changing someone's life, there's no use in beating their wall down. That's a long way around to answer your question.
Yeah.
I recognize that as I answer your questions, I feel like I'm standing on a soapbox, but what I really am doing is pouring into the person who's struggling and seeking. One of my greatest detriments to following Christ more completely was because as a rebel personality, I really thought that if I fully followed God with all my heart and obeyed all of his commandments, that it wasn't going to be any fun. I thought that God was going to be like medicine. It was going to be good for me, but it was going to taste really bad. And I can honestly say in the last 40 years that following Christ wholeheartedly is the best adventure I've ever been on.
I love that. Yeah, that's awesome. When did you say you believed in Christ as your savior? And like, how did that all go down? Like, where were you at? What was the gospel presentation you heard?
That's a good question, because I definitely fall into the category of a believer that grew in a Christian home, and my faith was a process, which was confusing to me because I had steps along the way where I made a further commitment to follow Christ. It's basically like turning over another chunk of your heart to Christ. I was 5 years old. My parents worked at a camp ministry during the summer. My mother was a nurse. And I started in their camp program when I was 5, which is astonishing today because it was overnight camp.
Oh, wow.
And I was there for a week or so at a time. Yeah, sleeping overnight in a cabin in a pretty rural setting. My mother was on the campus, so if I cried, she'd come running. But I have a very clear memory, and I was thinking about this as I read your questions, and I got a little emotional about it. I remember our counselor, and the counselors were probably 18, 17, 18 maybe. They seemed like old at the time. It was before we went to bed. I was on the top bunk, and I watched my counselor go to every single bunk and ask every child, was in the girls' cabin, of course, whether they wanted Jesus to be their special friend. So I met Jesus with a child's understanding, not as an adult understanding that I was a sinful creature. Here's a great analogy that my husband told his mom. It's great for kids. God is like a surgeon. Heaven is like the operating room. All may enter, but you must wash. And that was probably my childlike experience. And I prayed with her. I said, yes, I want Jesus to be my special friend. But what was fabulous to the counselors out there is that she came to us. She asked every child in the cabin to pray with her. And I thought, I'd love to see her today and say thank you. But I remember experiences when I was 12 at a camp. I remember when I was 16. So I worked in the dining room at camp and waitressing and cleaning up and setting tables. And we had like team leaders who were grown-ups. They gave us devotions every day. And it's good to remember that not a lot of it sticks, but it's making serious inroads into your heart and your character over the years. And then in my 20s, I struggled a lot with faithfulness. It's like a newborn colt, wobbly when I stand up. I really didn't know who I was and where I was going. And then when I was about 30, I think God really finally got a hold of me. But by then I had been in deep trouble by then. Life of sin and not following the Lord, with faithfulness.
How would you say, or when would you say you started taking your faith seriously? Would you say that was when you were 30? And then what do you think, I guess, changed then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I was around 30 and I worked really hard at opening my Bible and really trying to make God real. And, I think that because now I've had, 4 or 5 decades to add on to this, is that to remember that, and I just read this, either it was Pastor Chris or we read it it was in Psalms that Pastor Chris read at on Wednesday prayer, is that God reveals himself to those that follow him. God desperately wants to speak to us and spend time with us. And if we want to know him, he'll reveal himself to us. I was just very faithful it was work, opening my Bible in the morning after my daughter went to school and just reading and putting music on and just listening and just thinking about God.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And how would you say God started working in your life like right away after you started taking your faith seriously?
Well, your faith is like, when you're in a mess, your faith is like a garden that's overgrown with weeds. And I don't think you have a really good sight of what needs to get done until you get rid of it. At first, you get rid of the most noxious weeds in your garden, and then you can have a better view of what needs to get done, the work that needs to get done. And you just begin to pull weeds. And those weeds are sin or bad attitudes or, bad activities, sinful activities. And you just begin to whittle away, at your life. God wants us to be holy. And I had to trust him that if I really discipline my life to be more like Christ, but in a really fun way, because, Lois always wants to have fun. We can have fun with God, that he would bring about an abundant life. I sound like a saint, but there was a lot of hard knocks along the way.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't easy. And I make mistakes even today, with, impure thoughts and attitudes and cockiness and, boatload of pride. And, we all have. Pride is a renewable resource. So don't worry if you have to dump it for a while, because it'll just grow back like a bad rash.
Yeah, I've always said, I was talking to somebody else about this not too long ago, actually. It's kind of funny you mentioned it. Like, sin is so much like weeds, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know when that analogy first hit. Maybe I did hear it from someone. I probably did. I probably didn't think of it myself. But how, like, yeah, some weeds are a lot more obvious than others, but all weeds are weeds. And also, some weeds are a lot harder to pull out than others because they have deeper roots.
Yeah.
And also, like sin, if you really, like, if you try to pull a weed and you don't pull out the root, it's just going to come back.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously we're not going to be perfect, but God does call us to holiness, as he's holy. So I always think of like, yeah, sin is like, I think about this in my own life too, where it's like, we need to get rid of the root if we're going to actually continue living without sin, or else, yeah, if we don't see the root, we're probably going to just keep doing the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Another concept is that we think we're going to miss the sin. Stolen honey is sweet. We think it was so special, we're going to miss it if we uproot it from our life. But if you give it a little time, you realize you don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sometimes whether we admit it or not, we like the sin, and that's why we don't want to say it out loud.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Let's say it out loud because
we should. I mean, we don't maybe. Yeah.
That's the fun part of me when I say, "Oh, let's just say it."
Yeah. Jesus says that in this world we will have trouble. What are some troubles you faced after becoming a Christian?
Okay, that's good. I'll take you all the way back to the first year I graduated from nursing school. So that was in 1980. And I started to work on 5 East at the hospital. It was the biggest floor in the hospital and it was the craziest. Just a side note, you could still smoke in your room as a patient in 1980. And the nurses actually smoked at the desk. They were allowed to smoke at the desk as they worked, which was appalling today. You just can't imagine. I think there were about close to almost maybe 40 patients on that floor, which was huge, 2 to a room. And I got thrown in as a nurse. And as a new nurse, I was in my 20s, early 20s. And it quickly became apparent to me that the atmosphere was really rough. And it was really hard for me to maintain my innocence there, which went right out the window because of language and behavior and physicians trying to, pull one on you as a young nurse, and which was really common. If I may say that out loud, there was a lot of, temptation there with doctors and anyone else. You got thrown into a really, tough work atmosphere. And I had to, with language and my attitude, I became very cynical and sort of cocky. And I realized I had lost the sweetness of Christ. So I had to slowly pull myself out of that and begin to eradicate, my, the language issues and my attitudes, and just really secure my borders as a young woman and as a Christian. And that continued also when we moved to from Long Island to Pennsylvania. Now I was thrown into an ICU setting, and if I thought that Long Island was rough, on a regular floor, the ICU and the ER setting is very volatile. And I realized I had to really cement my standards as a believer in the work setting. And that, I'm sorry, but just takes practice. Over and over and over again, takes practice. But I have to say, once again, I want to live my life without regrets. And 5 years after I left, when I walked back into that unit, to visit my daughter if she was working there as a nurse's aide, they said to me, "You can have a job anytime if you want to come back." And sometimes it was the same people that gave me a really hard time for my standards. They will remember you if you do not sway from your values as a believer. And I guess you have to ask yourself, do I want to be like everyone else, or do I want to be different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
that's a great question.
Is Satan going to win, or am I going to bubble to the surface? You have to make a choice.
Mm-hmm.
So
how would you encourage someone going through that too? Like going through maybe a tough work environment?
I think I would challenge that person with questions, just self-questions, and say, how do I want people to remember me? And do you want Satan to win? And also, as far as your witness goes, you want to sit in the sidelines, you want to get into the game. Mm-hmm. You want to be part of the game. Yeah. Because if you live out your life victoriously, God is going to take on some fantastic adventures, and every experience is going to make us richer, as a person. Mm-hmm. You'll have great stories to tell about how God came through for you in your workplace. I always made it a point to try to reach out to my managers, because the cheese stands alone. They really feel like they're in a tug of war between the upper echelons of administration, and then, the peon at the bottom, which is you, nurses' aides and nurses and the rest of the staff. And I found that if I could just spend some time listening to them, it was a really great witness opportunity. I got to know each one of my managers there in a more, in a closer way in each department that I was in. So it's always opportunity.
Yeah, listening's huge. Yeah, how would you say your relationship with God changed through those struggles? You kind of touched on it, but
Well, just in short, it solidifies your persona as the believer. I used to think of some of my work experience as like Swiss cheese. So when you come out of nursing school, you're like Swiss cheese. It's full of holes. You know some stuff, but you have to fill in the gaps as you get experience. And the same thing with your Christian life. Instead of Swiss cheese, and this sounds really dumb, be more like cheddar cheese. I know who I am, and I know where I'm going, and you can't get me off my spot. Whereas in the past, it was more fragile, and I know where I'm going. I'm going to see my Savior, maybe tomorrow. So I think those experiences just solidify you in your faith.
Yeah, Peter talks about standing firm and learning to do those things. How would you say God has used marriage and motherhood in your life?
Well, how much time do you have? One of those youth leaders at camp said one thing that I remember out of his devotion. He said, marriage is designed to be a little bit of heaven on earth. And I never forgot that. God is all about relationship. And he created marriage. We grow, it's like a triangle. We grow closer together as we, put on some patina together as a marriage. And then as you grow together, you also grow closer to God. Since man was created in God's image, two halves of us, it's not all of who God is, but it's some of who God is. That oneness in marriage should be a reflection of our oneness in Christ as well. Marriage is defining. It has a lot of seasons. There's a lot of winters in marriage. And I happen to have a husband whose heart is pliable to God's Spirit. Without that, we never would have made it. As our third counselor said, we're not only opposite, we were the most opposite couple she had ever counseled. So it takes a lot of submission and a lot of apologies. But without yielding to God's Spirit, I don't know how people do it and how they do it. Same thing with motherhood. Motherhood is all about grace because I'm God's child. I have to look at my relationship with my daughter and my grandchildren through the eyes of grace. And that means never, ever, ever giving up on them. In the book, is it Gentle and Lowly? Yeah. By, oh man, I'm not going to be able to pull his name up.
That's okay.
Yeah, I won't get it. Pastor Chris read the same book and actually quoted from it. And I was like, oh, I just read that. Grace is what gets God up out of bed in the morning. He can't wait to extend grace to us. And I just keep reminding myself of that. Trust is not the same as grace. And in marriage, there's not always trust in a marriage. Not everyone has that in a marriage or with a child or a grandchild. But grace should be abundant. Grace should be, there should be an endless supply of grace. Mm-hmm. We're talking about, our pride having an endless supply, but our grace we should be offering grace to our families in the same way that God does.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how has reading the Bible for your personal time with the Lord shaped your relationship with God?
Well, you can listen to all the podcasts you want, and I listen a lot and put on beautiful music, and I sit at the piano and worship. That is my time of intimacy with God. That's where I worship, is in front of the piano. But something different happens when you open up His Word and you sit quietly. There's no substitute for sitting quietly. And I can remember, actually, it was one of our missionaries that had put this phrase in one of her prayer letters. And she said she was thankful for unhurried time with God. And I think we need to do that with God in the morning, not just for ourselves, but because He's waiting for us.
I like that. Yeah, that's cool. How has prayer impacted your relationship with God and others?
Well, with prayer, you get to see God show up time after time after time. And evidence of His existence comes by watching all those prayers be answered. So if you don't believe God exists, just start asking the Lord to show himself to you. And you're going to find that he's going to get started really quickly on that because he can't wait to show himself to you. Prayer not only does, because that sounds really selfish, like I'm just waiting for God to show up, but prayer, the door swings both ways. Prayer also reveals myself to me. I have to face him. If there's crap in my life, then when I stand before him, it makes you squirm. So we need prayer. It's like you get scrubbed behind your ears.
I haven't heard of the scrub behind your ears analogy, but that's not a bad one. How has going to church impacted your relationship with God and others?
Watching saints go before us over time. It's not just watching the saints when you grew up, it's watching them in your 30s and watching them in their 40s. So the people that have gone before us and their faithfulness has really encouraged me. And you're not gonna have that experience if you're just listening to podcasts. We really need to see each other, get to know each other, make mistakes with each other, and forgive each other. We can't avoid it because it makes us whole.
And have you had any impactful mentors, and what made them impactful?
Yeah, that's a very revealing question for me because I really don't like being mentored. Well, you know why, right? Because if they bring you up short on something, you have to do it. Can I say that out loud?
Yes.
So I can remember really squirming. I had one mentor a woman that asked me in my 20s whether she could get together with me. And I think that I resented it because she took the role seriously, which was great, but I felt that we weren't on a level ground. Probably one of the best, I wouldn't even say it as a mentoring, I would say it was a friendship where we kept each other accountable. I like that because, the ground is level at the foot of the cross. I think it's really hard for me to accept spiritual advice from someone, if they're on a cinder block one level above me. That's just me being a rebel. I don't really do well with submission. I'd rather talk to you as a friend rather than, you can see my pride coming out rather than someone saying, I have something to offer you. It's going to be good for you. So I think one of the best relationships was where I would just walk and talk and pray with someone several times a week. And that was good. That person's gift to me was praying about everything immediately. I would say my husband's grace in our marriage is a form of mentoring.
Like it influences you.
I'll give an example.
Yeah.
Where instead of saying, "How could you say that?" or "That was really disrespectful," one time he said, "Was that kind?" Ow. And you can be sure I never said that again, or with that attitude again. It really brought me up short, but in a very loving way. And he has mentored me by being the breath of Christ. Can I tell you a story?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I might cry. Not cry because the story was so awful, but because of the sweetness of the grace.
Okay.
I was spending time with a woman in Christiana that was from the hard knocks of life. And I would try to connect with her and get together with her and encourage her. And she had some mental struggles with stability. And she called herself a Christian, but she was also very angry at the Christian community because she felt that they had abandoned her. She had some medical problems, and she didn't have a car, and she needed to borrow a car to drive out to Pittsburgh for some testing, special testing. She was accusatory against believers because no one would offer her a car. So I talked to my husband about it. And on the day that she wanted to go out, I told her she could borrow my car and drive out to Pittsburgh. She didn't drive all the time, so driving was hard for her, a little less familiar. And I said to my husband, I feel like I need to follow through with this because of my witness to her. I wanted to show her that I could take a chance with her, even though it might cost me something. She borrowed my car for the day, and I had a restless spirit. I was uncomfortable in the morning, and I got a call about 10 o'clock in the morning, and it was this woman, and she said, "I'm fine, but your car has been totaled." She drove into the lane of a tractor trailer, and the car was just totaled. She was okay. It was difficult because there wasn't a lot of remorse on her part, and we had just paid our last payment on the car. Now we need to buy a new car. And when I told my husband about it, he didn't say anything. And we had a short talk about it, and he said one thing to me. He said, "If you had the choice to do over again, would you make the same choice?" And I did say yes. That's a side issue. A couple months later, he came downstairs, and he put an insurance card in front of me. And he said, "This is your new insurance card." And I said, "Oh, this isn't our insurance company. It's another group." And he said, "They dropped our insurance, and we had to find new insurance." And he never reprimanded me or was demeaning. He just put the card in front of me and told me we needed new insurance. Mm-hmm. If you ever need a picture of God's grace, that's it. Mm-hmm. So I'd have to say my husband is one of my mentors, even though I don't have a car. I didn't have a car. Oh, I had to borrow my mother's car for several months until we could, pull finances together. It was painful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are you passionate about and why?
I'm passionate about relationships because they teach us things. And I'm also passionate in these later years about spending more time in beauty, because today's world is so stressful. And God has created so much beauty around us. So I really try to surround myself. I try to create beautiful spaces, but also create beauty in relationships, beauty in my home, and beauty with music, laughter, that kind of thing. Because God, that's where God resides. God created so much beauty around us, and He wants us to live in it because He's there. And when we create beautiful spaces, we're also creating a space that's filled with love. Where beauty is, because God has created beauty, we're going to feel love. And that's what God wants us to see. That's just one thing.
Yeah, that's great. I like that explanation of, I never really thought about that, like how we can feel loved in beautiful spaces by God. That's cool though. How would you say God has gifted you and then use those gifts, I guess, for His kingdom?
I could talk you into your grave, but with that, I like people, and I like to hear about who they are and what they're doing. Spend time with people. So I'm a people person, but I've also had to really learn to be a good listener. My husband said early on in our marriage, it is not necessary to fill up all of the silence. So I actually talk to myself when I'm with other people to be still and quiet and listen. I worked as a nurse for 30 years, but I also did a lot of work with people that were on the fringes of life.
What do you mean by that?
Homeless, food banks, people that were struggling. And people would ask me why. And I would just say, because I can. I'm not afraid. That sounds cocky, but I realize by doing it that God has something to teach me. And I learned such great stuff from other people, even those that are struggling. Sometimes I learn the most things from people that are struggling. So besides from my vocation, my avocation was working with the disadvantaged. And I still do that in a small way today, but not as much. Sometimes you need a season of rest.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I was going to say, what do you do for work currently? Or what would you consider your work?
Hmm.
Obviously, like you're not
How do I spend time right
working.
now?
Yeah.
I consolidate my time. As I said at the beginning, I really try to focus on just several main things in my life because they bring me the greatest blessing, and that is people and music, creating a home, which I think is really a beautiful thing. I think it's important for men to help that creativity. My husband does that not in painting the walls, but by, assisting around the house or supporting me, in what I create at home. Music, I really like to work with ensembles. I did a lot of that years ago, but grandchildren took me away from that a little bit, but I'd like to do more. So, yeah, music, gardening, people.
Do you like making your own music or
I have done some of
spontaneous?
that.
Okay.
Yeah, I have several songs.
Cool.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
really cool.
I like to create, but I'd rather garden and practice rather than it takes a long time to put a song together.
Oh, I believe it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know, but that makes sense. Yeah.
And you need to spend a lot of time at it to make it, get in good shape.
Yeah. That makes sense. What do you garden? Like what different?
I love vegetable gardening, but it's on pause because, we had a big house flood. So the last 6 months we've spent putting our lives back together. But I really love propagating plants, growing more plants. So we've got about probably 500 feet of flower border at our house. And I could possibly work out there till I fall over. I mean, that's how much I love it. So
Awesome.
that and practicing.
How would you say God's working in your life today?
Sometimes he screams at me in my head. I think God is shouting at me in regards to his holiness. God wants me to be holy all the way through, not just on the outside, but all the way through to the inner parts of my heart. I don't want to just be sweet, in my marriage. I really try to be sweet, even though I'm not really a sweet kind of person. But I want to make sure that I really mean it, that I offer that, that sweetness up genuinely, to be genuine.
Yeah.
Oh,
Is there anything specific he's teaching you in his word?
That's probably most of it.
Mm-hmm.
And just about God's character. And finishing well, we were at a funeral this weekend, and the daughter of the woman that passed away said, you're born on a certain time and day, 1936, and then there's a dash after that. And then on your tombstone, there's another date. How you spend that dash is up to you. We get to choose to live without regret. And how I want people to remember me is really important to me. One of the most important things for me to do is to be genuine in everything I do. Because I spent 10 years as the biggest faker. I mean, I was a nice person, but I was a Christian faker. So it's very unsatisfying.
That makes sense. And how do you get spiritual rest with God?
That circles back to beauty. I take time, especially sitting out on the deck, bringing my Bible out there and just an unhurried time. I actually do it intentionally because of the wind and the bird sounds, because I feel closer to God out in nature rather than in a sterile, kitchen at the granite counter. I also linger. I spend time at the piano because that's where I can worship most freely. And God calls me when I'm there. He calls to me, and, sometimes I cry when I'm singing to him, and I could spend an hour there. So if, especially if I don't do that, if Neil's, working or something, but if he goes away for a few days, I'm often up to midnight playing at the piano and just singing for an hour and a half.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And circling back to talking about mentors, do you serve in any mentoring roles?
I probably do, but not in official capacity. So I like to think of my mentoring as just being an encourager rather than a teacher. I'd rather do life with people than, sit at a table and tell them where to go next. I feel like it would be prideful, to say I'm in mentoring roles, but I'm sure there are some roles that people, look at me. And right now, my involvement at church is with young adults, which we are, moving quietly out of because I'm 70 and my husband's going to be 73, and I think that the young adults need younger people to lead them, and then music. But I've had I've done a lot of parent care, so I'm not a committee person because I've done committees, and I felt that the most effective work that you can do to make progress in the spiritual community is to work one-on-one with people, off of committees. But that's a more favored spot. And your last question is following Christ worth it? I think it's the only way, but you have to discover that for yourself. I think it's important to know that you have choices. As a person growing up in the church, and that was not mentioned enough, and that's why I rebelled. I was told all the time, well, you don't have a choice. You do have choices. Christ gave us choices. And he said, you can follow me, or you cannot follow me, but you have to count the cost, and it's going to cost you. Christ wants us to spend eternity with him. And that question needs to be settled, before the last breath is out of us. You can do whatever you'd like for your entire life. God gives you the choice to do that, but you'll never see his face. That's the question to answer for yourself.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ambassadors Podcast. If you like this content, we appreciate likes, reviews, and sharing this with a friend. Thanks so much and have a great day. God bless.